Hey everyone, it's LS, and this video is going to be a mini jungle guide on the champion Ivern. So okay, before we get into the runes and masteries and the jungle roots and how to play Ivern, I want to talk about briefly the situations where you should pick Ivern or you can look to pick Ivern. Right now, I don't think Ivern is actually a versus all jungler, at least not in competitive, but in solo queue, he is pretty good, and he has a pretty okay time against a majority of the junglers. The only junglers that really give him a lot of trouble right now is Graves, Nidalee, and Lee Sin. Every other meta jungler outside of those three can basically be contained and they can be played around. If you're wondering about a jungle pick, Ivern is typically good if you have melee engaged supports or melee engaged top laners. If you have all ranged champions across all lanes, then Ivern might not actually be the best pick, even though his late game is pretty insane. On top of that, one of the things to also consider is that Ivern is arguably one of the best counter junglers in the game due to his ability to tap camps, which I'll touch on later, but also just the speed at which he clears the camps. Ever since the changes to jungle respawn timers, this can be extremely problematic for enemy junglers who might be at a risk when they try to go and counter jungle you, as long as your vision control is proper. If you get into the enemy jungler, there's almost no jungler that can actually stick or punish Ivern for attempting a counter jungle, primarily because of Trigger Seed and Rootcaller. Also, given that Ivern is a control and utility mage tank, he also takes on a pretty unique role inside of his team. In addition to that, because he only buys mostly mythical items, it means that he reaches his endgame a lot faster than any other champion in the game. This means that his mid-game power spike is likely to occur with his 2 core items when most champions are just getting 1. That's really problematic for opponents because of how effective his itemization path is for him at that point in the game. Okay, now we're going into runes and masteries. What you're going to want to take is 8 attack speed red, 1 crit chance red, 9 scaling HP yellow, 9 scaling magic resist blue, and then 3 movement quintessence. Alternatively, there's an option to take 5% flat CDR and 5% scaling CDR blue runes instead of the scaling magic resistance, because you get MR in your first item anyway inside of the Enthenes. Now, the reason that you want the attack speed reds is because Ivern doesn't really do a lot of damage anyway, but the attack speed reds will actually help you when you're attacking structures such as inhibitors and towers. Additionally, it'll also help you if you have your red buff, as you're going to be able to apply it a little bit more often than you would if you had any other type of red runes. The scaling HP yellows are pretty obvious because Ivern doesn't actually have to tank any of the jungle creeps, and he's not really going to be in any sort of danger tanking turrets early on, especially because he has a shield, and later on he's just going to be relying on Daisy. The scaling magic resist blues is, again, it's optional. You can swap this out for CDR, but if you do get the CDR later on, then it sort of makes the Ionian boots a inefficient buy, or you're actually going to overcap on CDR, which is something I don't like doing. The movement quintessences is basically because Ivern doesn't really benefit from having early AP, given how he coordinates his ganks, and there's really no reason to have it for clearing the camps because Ivern, again, doesn't attack them anyway. So the movement quintessence are really good at helping you get off your trigger seed early on when you're trying to gank an enemy. It's also really good for running across the map and tapping camps early on, and it also helps with being a little bit more safe when you're going for counter jungling. Now again, this is just for jungle Ivern. Support Ivern has different rune setups, but I feel like these are going to be the best. The only alternative that maybe you could argue is that maybe you just take magic penetration on your reds to make your ganks a little bit more powerful, but I don't value that nearly as much as the ability to basically attack turrets faster or inhibitors, especially given the fact that generally after level 6 ganks, you can look to apply a lot of turret damage with Daisy, so having the attack speed is greatly going to enhance the damage that you can deal to the turret. Okay, now moving into the masteries, you're going to want to make sure that you take 5 points in Wanderer, because that's really going to synergize with your movement quintessence, and Ivern doesn't really benefit from savagery at all. Next, you're going to take Runic Affinity so that you make sure that the buffs last longer, as Assassin and Secret Stash don't really benefit Ivern at all. Next, you're going to take 5 points in Merciless, because you don't need the Mana Restoration early on from Meditation to make any of Ivern's initial jungle roots work, or any of the cheesy clears. Following that up, you take Dangerous Game, so that the champion kills and assists restores 5% of your missing mana and HP. Bandit doesn't really benefit Ivern too much. And then Greenfather's Gift is virtually useless on Ivern because he doesn't really deal damage anyway. Next, you're going to take 5 points in Intelligence so that you can cap your CDR at 45%. That's going to let you spam your E and your Q more often. And then finally, for a Keystone Mastery, you're going to take Windspeaker's Blessings. This way your heals and shields are significantly stronger, and then in addition to that, because of how frequently you're spamming them out, it's going to equate to a lot of armor and magic resist being granted on whoever you're spamming your shields out on. Now we're going to go into the Resolve tree. We're going to take 5 points in Recovery, because even though Unyielding will be beneficial later on in the game, the HP regeneration early on is pretty important for Ivern and how he interacts, clearing his initial jungle roots. After this, we're going to take Explorer so that you get plus 15 movement speed in Brush and River. Again, this synergizes with Wanderer and the movement speed quintessence so that you're able to move around the map really quick and just be pretty slippery. Following that up, you take Runic Armor so that the shields, healing, regeneration, lifesteal are all 8% stronger, and then you round it out with Insight because this paired with Ionian Boots of Lucidity is going to give you 25% Summoner Spell cooldown reduction, and this means that your flash is going to be up more, and the other two Masteries that are available aren't really going to benefit Ivern that much. Now, some people have talked to me about going Courage of the Colossus on Ivern, but the problem that I have with this is that in the late stages of the game, Ivern doesn't really commit to the fights, and in the early stages, the Courage of the Colossus is not going to do as much as Windspeaker's Blessing, especially not in the mid-game. Ivern doesn't really commit to the fights hard enough for Courage of the Colossus to really be effective, and the E-shields are coming up so frequently that it doesn't really matter about that shield that Courage of the Colossus grants you. I would much rather have the Windspeaker's Blessing be super spammable than have a 30-second cooldown Keystone Mastery. In addition to that, you would also lose out on the 5% increase to the CDR cap, which I don't really think is something that you would ever want to do on Ivern. Now going into Ivern's skill order. Level 1, you want to make sure that you take Rootcaller, followed up by level 2, you take a Trigger Seed. At level 3, you want to put a point into Brushmaker, because that can potentially have a very big impact when you're going for ganks and you have red buff active. After this, I have seen a difference in Korea as opposed to NA and EU, where some Iverns actually max their Rootcaller first, but I like to put a lot of emphasis into the Trigger Seed because I feel like in extended trades it's extremely spammable, and the damage that it grants you early on is pretty nice in addition to the shield. I value having the Trigger Seed up more often and the effective HP that it grants over the enhanced root duration, which is barely noticeable early on, and the damage that is coming out of Rootcaller is negligible anyway. So the skill order that you're seeing on your screen is QEW into EE and then R. Once you have Daisy, then you're just going to max your E out, followed up by maxing out your Q. Now we're going to move into itemization for Ivern. This is where stuff can actually get a little bit tricky early on, and so again I've included a cheat sheet just like I did in the Tom Kench Jungle Guide that you're able to look at and determine if the itemization path that you need is going to be relative to the game flow that you're currently experiencing. Generally, if Ivern can't find a gank early on, his initial recall is going to be Boots and Darkseal. Darkseal is really good on Ivern because it gives him a little bit more HP from the refillable potion, but also he's able to stack up those stacks really quickly, and because he has relatively good AP base scaling, it's not a bad buy at all, especially because it sells back with such good efficiency. If you end up snowballing out of control, you can turn that into Magi's. Following this up, if you did get a successful gank off early on, but you didn't end up blowing your flash, buying Ionian Boots outright is sometimes a pretty good buy, because that means that you can be a little bit more careless with your flash, given that it's going to enhance the summoner spell cooldown reduction. Additionally, without the Ionian Boots, it's relatively difficult to cap at 45% CDR until the later stages of the game. So getting this is really important, because with Athene's Unholy Grail and blue buff later on, you're able to have 45% CDR very early into the game. Following getting Ionian Boots and Darkseal, I like to get Fiendish Codex over Chalice. The reasoning for this is because, again, Ivern has pretty good AP scaling on his abilities and the cooldown reduction that it grants. Follow this up by immediately going into Athene's Unholy Grail, and then the next item that you want to get is Redemption. Now, when you're going to build into Redemption, you have to ask yourself one of two questions. Am I ahead? If you are ahead and it's not going to really be too risky for you to engage in team fights, then you can go for Forbidden Idol before going for Crystalline Bracer. If you aren't ahead and if the game's even or if you're slightly behind, go for Crystalline Bracer so that you have a little bit more durability inside of team fights. After you complete Redemption, that's when Ivern basically has his biggest power spike. Following up after having these two core items inside of Athene's Unholy Grail and Redemption, the next items are always going to be situational. So again, I'm bringing it back to the cheat sheet, because the itemization path after this can get a little bit complicated. If you're still able to continue building into items at this point and your gold per minute is still pretty high, then you can immediately go into Haunting Guise, or you can begin to move into Zzrot Portal. Don't go into Zzrot Portal if a lot of towers have already been raised that game, because it's not going to really have that much effectiveness. If teamfighting is going really well for your team and you do want to contribute a little bit more damage, then definitely go into Liandry's Torment, because I think it's a very underutilized item on Ivern. After you complete either Zzrot Portal or Liandry's Torment, the next item that I like to actually complete is actually Cinderhulk. I always go for the red smite because the chilling smite doesn't really have a lot of utility, although I could see arguments for the green smite to give a little bit more ward coverage and assist with Ivern's brush play. Finally, if you really couldn't make that much use out of Darkseal and you were unable to turn it into Magi's Soul Stealer, just end up selling it and try to get a Guardian Angel, or you can even get another damaging item. Another item that you can complete as a 5th or a 6th item is actually going to be Solari. This is because the shield is really, really good for your team, and the way that Ivern coordinates inside of team fights, it's likely to get a lot of value out of this item. Alternatively, as again, another 5th or 6th item, you can go with Thornmail if the enemy team has a lot of AD. Lastly, before anyone else asks, if the enemy team comp is still pure AD, I still think that the heals and the utility granted out of Athene's Unholy Grail on Ivern specifically is still too valuable of an item to pass up. So don't completely forego it in favor of something like Frozen Heart or Iceborne Gauntlet, which I have seen some Iverns do. I think that the heals that come out of Athene's is way too problematic for enemies to really deal with, and the sustain that it grants Ivern from being able to stay on the map is just too valuable. Now that we have Ivern's runes, masteries, and itemization covered, I want to talk about a vocabulary word that I'm going to be using as this video goes on, and I've already used it a little bit already. It's the term tapping. He's a little bit unique in the sense that he can tap a camp with his passive Friend of the Forest and then move elsewhere on the map. Because of his ability to tap camps and then come back to them later, it makes it really good for him to actually conserve his smite if possible, if the camp is not going to immediately grant him a level up or something. You generally want to make sure that you're tapping camps in a way that you know that you're going to return to them soon, so that you can play out a route that is basically going to be a point A to point B, back to point A. Tapping camps as the game goes on is going to be a pretty big thing that actually separates Ivern players. Knowing where and when to tap your camps so that you're still able to retain enough hit points and mana so that you can still stay on the map, or how to plan your routes ahead of time, is really important to playing Ivern at a high level. Making sure that you micromanage how and when you tap camps is really important from separating yourself from other Ivern players and playing Ivern to his fullest. Now we're about to start on the jungler routes, but just before I do that, I want to talk about how important it is to make sure that you run to either the enemy's red or blue buff as soon as the game starts and get a ward down. That way you can know where they're likely to actually start their camp, because that's really important in Ivern's opening jungle routes, as Ivern always wants to start on the map opposite of the enemy jungler. Okay, now that we've gotten everything out of the way, let's actually go into Ivern's jungling routes. The first thing I'm going to cover is Ivern's blue side. Ivern typically always wants to start at the opposite side of the map of the opposing jungler because of Ivern's ability to go in and actually steal away a buff. As long as you have proper vision control, it's very difficult for an opponent to respond with a counter jungle of their own and try to steal away your buff. So let's start. First, on blue side, you're going to want to tap the wolves. Then you're going to want to use the blasting plant to shoot you over the wall onto your own blue buff. Tap the blue buff and then make your way over to the enemy red. When you get to the red, don't actually use your Q. I should also mention that it is possible to tap the Gromp buff if your bottom lane disrupted the enemy jungler at his blue buff, and you know that he's not going to be able to go over to his red buff immediately after clearing his blue. Once you get to the enemy red and you steal it away, look for a gank top lane before making your way back down to your blue side jungle and eating up all the camps. Make sure that you eat Gromp before blue buff to maximize efficiency on the blue buff duration, then eat your wolves. After this, move into your red side jungle and look to tap your wraiths in your red before recalling. Alternatively, if the enemy jungler is starting red, what you're going to want to do is tap your wolves, tap your red, and then go to the enemy blue and Q onto it from behind. Steal the blue and then maybe look for a gank in bottom lane. If you can't find a gank, make your way back into your red side jungle from Tribrush, tap your golems before going over and eating your red and your wraiths and making your way into your blue side jungle to tap all the camps before recalling. Sometimes you're not going to need to recall after moving into the blue side jungle with this jungle variation, and you can even look to do some sort of a gank up in top lane using the blasting plant to pop you over the wall and look for a quick gank using Trigger Seed. Now we're going to look at Ivern's red side jungle route. Again, you want to stay opposite of the enemy jungler in terms of a start. What you're going to want to start here on the red is you tap wraiths, you tap your red, and then you run to the enemy blue. Q to it from behind, and then smite it. Look for a gank up in top lane, and then look to go to your golems before making your way back through your red and wraiths and eating them. Then you can move into your blue side jungle and tap all of the camps, or again, look for a gank in bot lane. If you have to start on your blue side jungle and the enemy is starting on his blue, then what you're going to want to do is start with your wolves, then you make your way over to your blue, and then immediately go into the opponent's red side jungle. Q over the wall to get onto the enemy's red and steal it away. After this, you can look for a gank in bottom lane if the enemy bot lane is really pushed up. Otherwise, move back into your blue side jungle, tap your Gromp buff if you hadn't already, eat your blue side jungle, and then move into the red side jungle. Now that we talked about how to get to level 3 and level 4, we need to talk about how you can actually continue on as you're jungling. Again, one of the unique things about Ivern is the tapping interaction. You always want to make sure that you can actually save your smites. Ever since the changes to jungle respawn timers, Ivern is a very scary counter jungler, especially early on, because he clears his camps so fast, it leaves very little time for the enemy jungler to react and counter jungle you. However, when the enemy jungler's camps come back up, you want to be stockpiling your smite so that you can make sure that you go into the enemy jungle and you steal away a camp as fast as possible. This will put a lot of pressure on the enemy jungler, and then you can fall back into your own jungle and eat up your tapped camps. As the game draws on, you want to make sure that you're always being cognizant of how much experience a jungle camp is going to give to you. If you have to commit to tapping camps, but it's not going to be beneficial to you leveling up, then don't stick around to try to clear them. Tap them and get out of the way. If a camp would affect you leveling up before a gank is about to happen, then make sure to actually just expend your smite to get that level up so that you can move into the gank with stronger stats. The longer the game goes on, unlike some other junglers, Ivern actually wants to pre-plan his routes even 2 minutes in advance. What I mean by that is it would be normal for a jungler to go from one side of the map to the other if he plans on ganking at the end of his route. Ivern, on the other hand, wants to plan his routes even further in advance so that he's able to do 2 potential gank routes. One is he taps on his way over to make a gank, and then on his way back from making a gank, he can pick up his entire jungle. Another thing is don't be afraid to use your smite to heal you leading up to team fights. That's another alternative to stockpiling the charges, is that you can use them accordingly and get the heals off from them. Okay, now that jungling is out of the way, I want to talk about ganking. Ganking with Ivern is a little bit unique from other junglers, and the movement quintessences that we took are a direct part of how you're actually going to organize your ganks. When you move into gank a lane, make sure to cast Trigger Seed on yourself or an ally to get the slow off on an opponent. If the lane is really long and there's a lot of room between the enemy and their turret, then sometimes you want to use no CC as CC because they might try to anticipate and juke the Rootcaller. If you have red buff, then you want to make sure that you can try to somehow get a cast time down on Brushmaker so that you get the enhanced range on your auto attacks so that you can begin applying the slow. Spam your E on whatever allies need it, and mostly spam it on yourself if you're coming up from behind an enemy. This way, you're able to conserve your Rootcaller until it's absolutely necessary, and you can use it at the most effective time. Ivern early on doesn't really have a very strong 2v2, but because Ivern's jungle roots are so weird, it's very unlikely that the enemy jungler actually meets you in 2v2 scenarios. Don't forget when you're ganking as well that you can place Brushmaker on top of yourself or your allies to disrupt vision temporarily. In a counter gank or a match gank scenario, Ivern is pretty powerful because of the disruption from Brushmaker and the disruption from Rootcaller. Generally though, you want to avoid proactive 2v2s until you have Daisy. Once you have Daisy, 2v2s become extremely easy and 3v3s become pretty busted for your team. Another thing about Ivern is because of Rootcaller, you can actually use it to hop over into Dragon Pit and into Rift Herald or Baron to coordinate ganks in the mid part of the game, or even early on. This can be used to get around wards that would typically spot you inside of either top or bottom tri-brush. When ganking bot lane or top lane, you can also make use of the blasting plant to pop yourself right into the brush immediately and summon Daisy to start charging at the opponents. Additionally, if the enemy is already out of position, you can just use the blasting plant to get into the brush as an element of surprise and start running at them with Trigger Seed active. Finally, at the end of ganks, if you're already level 6 and Daisy's still active, try to make the most use out of her that you can, whether it's to go through the enemy's jungle and use her as a living ward, or to start pushing down a turret, casting Trigger Seed on her to maximize her effectiveness. One of the unique things about Ivern is actually Daisy, and that's the thing that we're about to talk about next. So sort of like a scene from the movie Norbit, Ivern actually has a very angry big girlfriend, except this time it's not Rasputia, it's Daisy. And Daisy is pretty obnoxious given that she can regenerate HP out of combat, and one of the things about Daisy is that she's pretty quick. Having a flat movement speed of 419 means that no champions can get away from her when you're starting a gank with her. Also, she can actually be controlled where you're going to summon her, so don't just try to click somewhere randomly, because this can also mean that you can summon her over and below walls, which can greatly impact teamfights and also grant your team vision. She does have a tether range, and she doesn't return to you, similar to Annie or Mordekaiser's old dragon used to, so you do have to basically keep her on a leash because sometimes she just gets a little bit out of control. That aside, when you start ganks with her, you generally want to throw your Trigger Seed on her as she runs at the enemy. She'll end up probably proccing her passive off of the slow that the Trigger Seed grants, and then she can apply a ton of CC. After successful ganks, if turrets are low on HP or you're trying to capture First Blood turret, you can use Daisy to tank a lot of the turret's damage. You can keep putting Trigger Seeds on her to tank even more and let your normal minions live even longer. When Daisy starts to get low on HP, you want to tell her to go outside of turret range for a few seconds while she regenerates all of her HP, and then you want to bring her back in. You can also do this at other points in the game, especially if you want to keep her living throughout the entire duration of a team fight and a follow-up push. Another cute thing that you can actually do with Daisy is you can use her to solo Rift Herald. Unfortunately, she's not that great at soloing Dragon, although I'm pretty sure you could do it, it would just take you a really long time. Another thing to be cognizant of when you're trying to use Daisy is when you're trying to secure Baron or Dragon and the enemy's trying to contest, you can keep her at the outskirts of the teamfight to basically act like a mini gatekeeper, preventing opponents from coming in. Because at that point in the game, it's very likely that you'll be level 11 or 16 and Daisy's stats are going to be really tanky. Don't forget that Daisy also can act like a living ward, so if you get a successful gank off on maybe bot lane or top lane, you can use her to scout ahead of you as you try to invade the enemy's jungle to make sure that you don't get caught out. Now that we've talked about all of that, let's move into Ivern's teamfighting. Ivern's teamfighting early on is basically just about guaranteeing that you get your trigger shield off and you use it to shield teammates that are in need to absorb as much damage as possible. Later on, you want to be aware of who you can heal with your Athene's Unholy Grail during the teamfight, not just giving your ally a shield. When you're teamfighting, make sure to use brushes to deny vision from the enemy team, especially if they're heavily reliant on click-based abilities or auto attacks. You can use this to disrupt vision and give your team an advantage. Make sure to place them strategically as if they were mini bunkers. When you're starting to siege turrets, if you don't have Daisy, try to place your brushes out to deny vision. And then with the vision, as long as you guys are standing inside of the brush, it can get a little bit scary for the enemy and they might be forced to back off. Before a teamfight breaks out, you just want to be aware of when it exactly is going to break out, because that's going to give you the opportunity to summon Daisy. You don't want to summon Daisy before the team fight breaks out because there's a chance that maybe they can try to kill her. Remember to use Daisy as a giant meat shield because she absorbs enemy skill shots and she acts as a very obnoxious CC that's able to basically gun for the backline while your teammates are fighting, or she can be used to actually peel and block for the carries of your team while you're still providing massive amounts of shields. Don't forget to endlessly spam your shields and hold your Q for proper opportunities to make sure that you're snaring at the correct times. Don't waste your snare needlessly. If the team fight is dragging on too long, as I mentioned just a moment ago, you want to tell Daisy to get away from the fight. This is going to let her regenerate all of her HP, and if your team ends up winning the fight, you can use her to secure some objective. Rounding it out, Ivern in teamfights, again, wants to make sure that he can both act as a taunt indirectly and as just a giant peel bot for his teammates. Use the brushes and the shields accordingly to basically maximize efficiency and bait your opponents into unfavorable situations. When you're using Redemption, generally try to use it in the middle of a teamfight and try to maximize value so that you're able to get your Windspeaker's blessings off on multiple allies. If during the teamfight you guys are just having to stall because you have a Zzrot portal elsewhere on the map, then just make sure to use Daisy in a defensive manner as well as the brushes. You can also use the brushes underneath your turret to provide vision control and vision denial of your opponent if they're trying to siege you under tower. Anyways, always remember to push Ivern to his limits. A lot of fights can be very misleading for both your team and your opponents because your shield is so impactful and the heals that are granted off of the Athene's Unholy Grail. Now we're going to talk about some of the unique ways and creative ways that you can use Daisy to create advantages for your teammates. One of the things is that using Daisy to run up behind turrets behind the opponents is something that is pretty surprising, and it's difficult for the opponent to deal with because you don't actually start taking aggro until Daisy hits someone. This can mean that even if the enemy bot lane or top lane or mid lane is pushed up, you can actually come completely from behind, denying their ability to run back to their turret using Daisy to tank for you. She's not going to take too much damage, and you're probably not going to eat any tower shots anyway. This is very similar to how Lee Sin can ward jump around turrets in top and bottom lane to secure ganks. Another type of cheese that you can do, and not many people know about it, is that you can actually place brushes on top of Dragon or Baron, or even Rift Herald. If the opponent doesn't have a ward inside of the brush, they can't actually see in, and then that means they can't hit the target or smite it. This is actually something that's really important to do if something is going to come down to a smite fight, because it makes it that much more difficult for the jungler to get vision. Even if they have wards around the neutral objective, they still can't see into the brush. One thing that's interesting about this, though, is that if you do it to Baron and an opponent clicks onto the location of the brush, it seems that Baron is actually coded as a structure, so they'll end up taking a very bizarre auto-pathing route. Make sure that when you're fighting inside of the rivers that you're using your brushes always to deny vision from the enemy team when you're trying to contest a major objective. If you're face checking into the enemy's jungle, then you can also summon brushes to get temporary vision and see if you're walking into a trap. I think that outside of that, there's not really too many cheeses or unique things that are really going to be outside of the norm. Just remember that using your Rootcaller to hop onto Dragon or Rift Herald early on to get around vision that your opponent has placed is really, really strong when coordinating ganks, especially if you have Daisy. Ivern also benefits a lot from making sure that he can make use of the blasting plants because he seems to make use of them much more than most of the other junglers currently. Also, as a tip, I tend to try to stay away from getting Scuttle Crab because of the time that it takes early on and because it's not a worthwhile investment for your smite. Only take it if it's absolutely necessary and there's nothing else for you to do and you need the gold or the experience. So anyways, that's going to do it for the Ivern guide, and I hope that you all really enjoyed it. Remember that your mindset when you're inside of the game is that while Ivern does have a very fast power spike, he is ultimately a very powerful late game champion that can easily turn games around because of his Trigger Seed and Daisy's impact later on. So even if you fall behind, don't panic because Ivern is really great at turning games around. Anyways, that is it for the guide, and thanks a lot for watching, guys. Bye!